We won't do a lot of PowerPoint, but I do want to kick off the Getting Started with MRP session on some really key important topics, and it really wraps around how the software thinks about the process and trying to get the software to mimic what you would do if you didn't have the software. And so there's certain key fields that we want to take into account. I'll kind of review them through the PowerPoint. I'll make the PowerPoint available after the session, and then we'll look at it in the software and actually go through some examples, changing some of the parameters and then watching what the planning process does with those changes. So what is MRP? In the software's terms, it's two things. One is MPS and the other is the actual MRP. Some people treat them as the same thing, but they are very different. MPS is the master production schedule. So that is your direct demand, where I have a sales order and that demand is going to do something. It's going to create a parent item. So maybe it kicks off a production order to build that item. Then there's MRP, which is the material requirements planning, and that's your indirect demand. So when I have my sales order, that's my direct demand to create a production order. That production order will have components, that's my indirect demand. So the sales order triggers both demand for the finished good, the production order item, and then also indirect demand on those components required for the production. Now, in some cases, you'll have spare parts that you sell. So the sales order will create direct demand on a potentially a raw material or just a bought and sold item. So there are chances that you have a raw material or component part that you do have direct demand for. But for the most part, we want to think about it as MPS being typically to create your finished goods, MRP to pick up the component demand, the sub-assemblies, anything that is not a one to the sales order demand side, so the indirect side of it. So when we talk about sources of demand inside of Dynamics Nav or Dynamics 365 Business Central, it comes from a lot of different places. So I mentioned a sales order, that's where most people think. But the sources of demand are quite broad. So this is a list of them. I won't go through all of them, but common ones are the sales order, the production order. If I'm dealing with multiple locations, transferring goods between them. So that could be your inventory levels requiring transfers, job, service, those sort of things. So those all trigger demand or a reduction of my quantity on hand. Okay, the counterbalance to that is sources of supply. So this is how do I get material into my shelf, and that would be a purchase order. So I just go and buy it. It could be a production order where I'm making the finished good or I'm making the sub-assembly. Again, could be a transfer in a multi-location facility. Even returns. So I shipped a product to a client. Maybe I sent them the wrong product and they need to return it, or I sent them a product and it arrived damaged, so I need to return it. That is a supply coming back in, and I have to be careful of that because that may not be a valid source of supply. So I do want to make sure when I'm doing sales returns that I put them into a quarantine state and make sure I can review them before they become usable inventory again. So we just want to be aware that some things that you don't think about creating supply, anything that takes our quantity on hand up is a source of supply to the software. Now, what are some of the key fields that impact all of the system calculations? Because the way it works is we reviewed supply and demand. That's what the system's calculating. It's what is my demand, my negative, and what is my positive, my supply, and are they in balance? And if I'm in the negative, then I need more of something. If I'm in the positive, I have a surplus and I don't need more. So what are the fields that impact that within the software? Now, if you're not in manufacturing, this doesn't apply as much, but there's a manufacturing setup that you can set a field called components at location. And I'll walk through that in my example, where I have one location called main, and all of my items, even though I'm not using SKUs, it treats those item cards as if they're for the location main, and that's because I'm using this field. It's not required. If I have just a single location, we like to turn that on because it helps keep everything in one main location, but you don't have to. The other one is the default dampener period. This is where we're getting into more of an advanced topic on how to quiet down the suggestions from the MRP, but it's a really critical field for doing just that. And the global value is in the manufacturing setup. So if you need to know where to go to find that, that's where it is. You can also find a dampener period on each individual item, but the global value is in manufacturing setup. Now talking about the item card itself. So we have the replenishment system field, so there's a replenishment tab, but one of the fields on that is the replenishment system. This has zero impact on the calculation of what is my supply versus what is my demand. The only thing that this field is for is what is the result of that supply and demand calculation. So if I need to make more, do I buy it? Do I produce it? Do I assemble it? Or do I transfer it? And the transfer option is only on a stock keeping unit, so a location code field for that specific item, because you can't transfer if you only have one location. So it is on the stock keeping unit if I need to transfer between locations. So this is really what happens after my planning calculation of supply versus demand. So it's what happens, what does the system suggest I do when this item needs to create more supply. Okay, so if it's a production item, on the replenishment tab, there's a manufacturing policy. Two options, make to stock, make to order, fairly self-explanatory. The make to order is the one that is a little trickier because if I need to nest my sub-assembly items on the parent item production order, then I'm going to use make to order. So it allows me to have one production order that lists not just the parent, but also the sub-assemblies within it, or at least any sub-assemblies that are also in the make to order status. Where make to stock, every single item creates a new production order. I would say most people favor make to stock, where each item being produced creates its own production order. But if I'm getting overloaded with paperwork and I want to simplify some of that and tracking, I can use make to order to group those onto one production order. So that would be that policy decision. Very similar on assembly policy in terms of two options, assemble to stock, assemble to order. Assemble to stock makes a assembly order, assembly to order also makes an assembly order. So both create a one-to-one for the item being produced. Assemble to stock allows the assembly order to be independent of the sales order, where the assemble to order is a assembly order that is created automatically and immediately associated with the sales order, and you do not break that link. So assemble to stock creates its own independent. Essentially, I build it, put it on a shelf, and then ship off my shelf. Assemble to order, I'm building it in the shipping process, and so that is where that policy comes into play. And you do not use both. So I'm either using the manufacturing policy because I have my replenishment set to production order, or I'm using the assembly policy because my replenishment is set to assembly. If I'm using purchase or transfer, these don't apply. Okay, now the core of what triggers the MRP calculation. There is a field on the planning tab of the item called Reordering Policy. every single bit of what I'm about to talk about in this entire series is on this one field. Because if I leave it blank, which is a viable option, the MRP calculation will completely ignore the item. And that's really important if I have items that we're still adjusting what our parameters are and we're manually making the decision on when to buy it, or I simply don't want the system to calculate it. I know that this is a rarely ordered item and I don't want anything to really get in the way or calculate for me. We'll plan it accordingly, so I can leave it blank and the system will ignore it and I have to manually plan that item. Okay, so that is an option. Then we have 4 reordering policies, and we'll look at each of these today, but we're going to go through them as quick as I can. I did write notes into this PowerPoint that you can look at when we send it out to everybody, but the fixed reorder quantity is when I get to a certain reorder point, so either stock out or to a certain stock level, it orders a fixed amount. It does not change. It always orders the same amount. We'll look at that one first when we go through our sample. The maximum quantity is very similar to that. The difference is the amount that we order fills up our space. So maximum quantity is designed when the item fits on a certain shelf, and that is the only shelf that it goes onto, or I have a limited amount of space within my warehouse that that item can be stored in. And so it will order up to the maximum space allowance without ordering more. This does mean it can be variable. So if I'm at 50 instead of 55 and it triggers demand and my max quantity is 100, when I'm at 45, it'll order 65. When I'm at 50, it'll order 50. If I'm at 55, it'll order 45. So the maximum quantity, the amount that you reorder, can be variable. And so there's parameters we can put on that to guarantee that we're buying in certain box sizes or length sizes, certain things to control that variability of that. But we'll look at some of that as we get in the software as well. The last 2 are what we consider order policies. So the first 2 being stock, we're buying for our shelves, we're filling up our shelves. The other 2 we're filling demand. So it's more of a direct correlation. Order is a 1-to-1 correlation. When I have 5 parts being ordered on a sales order, I have a subsequent supply of 5. So if I'm doing a buy-sell relationship, so I'm creating purchase orders for everything I sell. If I sell 5 units, I create a purchase order for 5. If I have 3 sales orders, each one for a quantity of 5, I'm going to have 3 purchase orders, each with a quantity of 5. I will have a 1-to-1 relationship with every single source of demand. Okay, so that is a full 1-to-1 relationship between the buy and the sell, or the supply and the demand. Okay, lot for lot is a variation of that. So lot is where you have a source of demand and you have a time bucket that you counted up in. So in the previous example, 3 sales orders with quantities of 5 each. That means I have a total demand within my accumulation period of 15. I will get an order for 15. So I'm still getting the exact amount of supply to the demand with a lot for lot, but I also have the ability to do more or less than that. So with lot for lot, I can put on parameters that say, I want you to always buy in quantities of 20 or greater. So when my demand is 15 and my lot for lot policy takes over, my minimum order will be 20 units. Okay, but I may also have safety stock in there that says, okay, 15 units is my demand, plus I have a safety stock of 10, so now I'm at 25, and then 20's over, so maybe it'll order 25, but maybe I have a multiple of 10, so we buy in boxes of 10 over anytime I order over 20, and I know this is a lot of numbers, but essentially you're going to order 30. So the minimum order of 20 in groups of 10 to fulfill 25 demand gets me up to 30 units. And so it'll order 30. I'll consume the 15 for my sales order demand and get those shipped out the door, and I'll have some leftover inventory. And then it'll consume out of that before it orders more in that lot for lot policy. So there's a lot going on for lot for lot. I like to think of it as one of the most flexible policies, and you can kind of tie it back up to fixed reorder, which can also be fairly flexible, or at least accommodating depending on what the needs are. All right, so let's talk about the planning process. Okay, inside the software there is there's two options. One is called the planning worksheet, and the other is called the requisition worksheet. Everything I do today, I'm going to do in the planning worksheet. Okay. If you're on an older version of Dynamics Nav, you may not have a license that allows you to run the planning worksheet. In that case, use the requisition worksheet. The planning worksheet is more powerful. It has a more sophisticated planning engine than the requisition worksheet. The requisition worksheet is very good in terms of the direct demand. It's the indirect demand, the MRP process, that it falls down on. And it will still do it. You just have to run it multiple times to pick up all of the layers. Where the planning process will start at the sales order, create a production order, create the subcomponents, buy the components for those subassemblies, and date orient all of those so that they're all planned in one run. So it's a more sophisticated planning process, right? And so when you run this, you're going to do pretty much three things. Click on either the planning or the requisition worksheet. You're going to prepare the worksheet, which is running either calculate plan or calculate regenerative plan. And you're going to set your parameters. And the parameters are your start and end dates. So we like to call that the planning horizon. It's a really important window of time, because what you are telling the system is, I want to calculate supply and demand from a specific date to a specific date. If I have forecasted or future sales orders that go outside of that planning date, so let's say the end of the year, you wouldn't do that now that we're in the beginning of the year, but let's say the end of the quarter. Okay, so I have sales demand outside of Q1, then it's not going to plan for that. If my planning horizon is the first quarter of the year, it's only going to plan for events that happen in that first part of the year. Now it'll plan all of them, but you control what that fence is. Now, if I have really long lead times, then I'm going to use a longer planning horizon, and I may want to go out to the end of Q2, maybe Q3. I've heard people talk about lead times as far out as 18 months long, so you need to be specific for that. Now, if I have one item that has an 18-month lead time and everything else has a 6-week lead time, I'm going to plan that one item separate than I do everything else. Okay, so be smart with how you do it. Don't try to make it a blanket for everything. Try to do it in item category groups or something like that to help isolate what you're actually planning for. The most critical factor here is knowing what items you're planning for and what their lead times are. If I have a lead time that is 6 weeks to buy all the material and actually produce the good, or even just get it shipped into our door, and I have a planning horizon of 4 weeks, I'm guaranteeing I'm going to be 2 weeks late before I even start the process. Okay, so make sure your planning horizon, your window of time, is longer than your actual lead time. Otherwise, you're dead in the water before you even get started, right? So you want to make sure that it's longer How much longer is kind of up in the air. It could be a week, could be 2 weeks. It really depends on how accurate your lead times are. If you have vendors that are historically bad at delivering on the lead times they promise you, maybe give it a bigger cushion and go 3 weeks out, maybe even a full month longer than you need to, or that you should need to, right? And then the second would be filtering it. So I can, before I order any of the parts, we're going to see the order date as we get our results back from the planning. And you can filter down on that order date, so you're only buying what really needs to be bought either within the week, within 2 weeks, whatever the case may be, just in case your vendors don't respect your requested delivery date. They may ship it to you as soon as they get the order. So to make sure that you're not getting products sitting on the shelf for 3 months, respect the order date, filter down on it before you carry out your action to buy that. And then it's really just kind of checking. So I will say that you want to review what happens. Do not do this in a live environment. You need to be testing in a test company. You can still be in the same database that you're in, but you want to be in a test company. And then you can run as many processes, as many buys, as many sells, consume, do what you need to play with the numbers. Don't do this in your live company. It'll mess everything up. You'll be doing a restore. Let's do everything in a test company or in a sandbox test environment. Okay. The big one here on checking the results is know what you are expecting before you run the plan. So every time we run through some scenarios today, I'm going to tell you what I think the planning worksheet will suggest for me. And I hope I'm right, but I should have at least a good guess of what it's going to tell me before I run my plan. Okay. And if I don't do that, then when I get my suggestion back, I don't know if it's good or not. I can try to figure it out after the fact, but you're better off knowing, well, based on the criteria that I've set up for this test, I expect to get this result. And then you run your test and you see what your result is and you find out, did I hit the mark or do I need to adjust? And when you're getting started with this, it's all about trial and error. Okay, you're going to start with one item, you're going to set it up brand new, and you're going to control all of the variants that come into this. So I'm going to control lead time, I'm going to control quantity on hand, I'm going to control any sales or production or demand and supply, so that I know exactly what is happening to this item, and I'm going to run my planning for just that item so that I can control everything going on around it and get the results I want. That's the fastest way and easiest way to review it. Okay, the last point on this slide is really important. The software is not broken. Okay, this is a tool and a software package that is used by hundreds of thousands of companies with over 2 million users. Okay, they don't all run MRP, but there's a lot that do. Okay, and the software works for them. It'll work for you too. It's not broken. Most of the problem is data related. So I didn't use the right date, or I didn't have a certain field set. So that's where this PowerPoint is going to be helpful. So you can go back, review what fields are important, and work with the data and just keep running it, run it over and over and over, changing different variants as you go to try to get the results you want. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to jump into the software and we're going to take a look at some of this. Okay, so what we're looking at right now, this is BC, I want to say 17, the newest version out. It's a demo environment. It might be BC 16. Everything that I showed today is actually in Nav all the way back to probably 5.0. So even if you're on Nav 2015, 2018, 2009 R2, I mean, it really doesn't matter. Okay, what I'm going to show you is there. There's maybe one little factor that I'll point out as we go that isn't there. Okay, Now, if I'm in one of the more modern versions, I do have the ability to have saved filter sets. So this is the one sample item that I set up for today. Like I said, in testing, quantity on hand 0. When we go in and look at that item, I have no purchase orders, no production orders, no sales orders. Everything is zeros across the board for this item. Okay. And then if we come down to replenishment, the one field that matters on this tab, because I have it set up as a purchase, is the replenishment system. So it will suggest a purchase document. I'm not going to get into production orders or anything today, or even jobs or assemblies. Those are all viable options, but I'm really just going to focus on the purchase today. So it's going to suggest a purchase order to me. Because of that, it'll suggest it to my default vendor, and we can look at that and how that comes into play. I do have a default lead time of 3 days. I'm not sure that'll come into play right away, but it might when we start getting into the lot for lot or order policies. But for right now, we're going to go with the replenishment system purchase. And then I do have a value set. So if I have this set to blank, it'll ignore this item altogether. Okay, so if I ran the planning worksheet, I would not get the suggestion for this item. So I do want to have one of these set. We're going to start with the fixed reorder quantity. Okay, and like I said at the very beginning, when I'm at or below my reorder point, so 5, and I currently have 0, so that's a trigger, and it's going to suggest to me whatever the reorder quantity is. So in this case, 50. So knowing that everything else is 0 and it is below my reorder point, when I run the MRP, I expect to get a suggestion to order 50 units. Okay, so let's go and test it, see if I know what I'm talking about. Okay. So again, I'm running the planning worksheet. There is, again, the requisition worksheet. Similar process. One is called calculate plan. The planning worksheet is calculate regenerative plan. It is a more complex calculation rhythm, but just understand that it will work for both. So like I said, when I'm in the planning worksheet, I'm setting a planning horizon. So a start date and an end date. This is demo environment, so my data is back in 2020. So I'm sorry to take people back into 2020 now that we finally got out of it, but that is where my data is. So I'm going to run it with a long planning horizon, almost 6 months there, to encapsulate the end of 2020. And I'm going to filter it on our single item 5,000. You can set location filters, you can set item category filters, pretty much any filter on the item card I can filter to it. Talk to one of our consultants on it if you have questions on it, and we can help guide you on what might make sense for your particular filters. The reason you filter it is to make it run faster. So if I'm running this process manually, then I want to make sure that it's not, I set it to run and I have to wait 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, for it to calculate through 20, 30,000 items. Okay, so make sure you're setting filters. Even better, set the filters up and run an automation that happens at 3 a.m. in the morning. Okay, when no one's in the system, no one's touching it, and it can churn and run through all of the complex calculations to give you a suggestion. Okay. The one thing I will point out is this respect planning parameters. So you want to have this turned on I want to say it's version 5.0. This might not be available in some of the older versions. It's not available. You want to have this turned on. It makes your calculation process, if you happen to stock out of something, the old versions would just say fill up to your stock level and that was it. So now this respect planning parameters still buys based on your planning criteria. So that would be my order multipliers, my min order requirements, those sort of things. So that is something that's in the newer versions of the software. If it's there, you're good to go, leave it on. If you're in older versions, maybe talk to us about upgrading, that sort of thing. Okay, even if you don't have it, it's going to be okay most of the time. It's just in stock out situations, which this will hopefully avoid. That is where that comes into play. Okay, so we'll run it, and we get our results back really quick because it's only calculating the one item, and you'll notice that it's suggesting a order quantity of 50. So if we happen to forget, I can have quick access, so the fact box over here on the right will link me back to that item. I can also click on this little hidden warnings thing. You see that little line there? That'll actually open up an untracked planning elements, and it is nice because it tells me, okay, reorder point was 5, we're below that, we're at 0. The reorder quantity is 50, so you need to order 50. Okay, so that's my little cheat sheet on being able to look up. If I was doing 50 items in my test here, that might be too much to really know everything that it was going to do for you, but you can use that as a way for the fixed reorder and the max reorder quantity fields to look up what the planning criteria is for that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and process this. So if I agree with the suggestion, then I just do what it says. If I don't agree with the suggestion, so let's say I expected it to order 75 and not 50. Something was wrong with my data. Okay, so that is where it's time to go and check your data. Go and look at your item card. If you're using multiple locations, you should be using stock keeping units. And so if you're in multiple locations, go and check the stock keeping unit card, because there's values on there that are different for each location. So if I have 5 locations, I better have 5 stock keeping units for that item. So what does that item look like in each of those locations? They may all be the same, they may be different. And so depending on the suggestions I get, that could be a source of the data. And I want to go and review it and see what it says. Okay, so that is where you want to know what it's supposed to say. Don't just come in and make this 70, right? Don't change the information here. Go fix your data so that when it makes the suggestion, it makes the suggestion you want. The main idea with the planning worksheet is I should be able to look through this, see what's coming up. If I'm a purchasing agent, I may know, well, I can buy this from that other vendor, right? So I can come in and say, well, what other vendors can I buy this particular item from? Well, this one has a longer lead time. This one's 3 weeks to get it. So maybe if I have a lot of time, maybe this vendor is cheaper, and so I can deal with the longer lead time. But you want to know about that stuff. That's more of a purchase management than it is just running the planning worksheet. Okay, so if I'm comfortable with this, this will create a purchase order. So if I go ahead and process this and I agree with it, and do be aware, so if I come here and I run my process carry out action and nothing happens, that means I probably didn't have this accept action message checked. Okay, so this is where I come in and I select yes, I want it on. If there are no warnings and no problems with this particular item, meaning the dates make sense, the quantity makes sense, I already have a vendor selected, all of the criteria is met for this to be a viable option, this will be checked by default. Okay, so if I don't want to buy it right now, I can uncheck that and it will leave it in my planning worksheet. It will still factor in that it's planned at some point, and it'll take care of whatever else is in my worksheet and create the purchase orders or production orders or transfers or whatever it's making for those items. So that is an important field. So we'll go ahead and carry that out. That'll create a single purchase order, and then it'll blank my worksheet. Okay, so when I've carried out my action, I should be coming back to either a blank worksheet or a worksheet that has only items that have not been accepted. Okay, that is what I should expect when I have my worksheet. I am a big fan of having this worksheet be blank rather than leaving a bunch of lines that don't have the accept action message. And the reason for that is because you can have a situation where you have multiple batches. And I may have 5 different purchasing agents and some items that they buy overlap. Well, if Tammy has it on her worksheet and Steve needs to order it, it's going to see that it's on Tammy's worksheet and it's not going to suggest it on Steve's worksheet. So you want to be careful of that as well. That's why I'm a big fan. If you're working in the planning worksheet or the requisition worksheet, you clear your worksheet when you're done. Okay, you can always come back, prepare, and calculate a new plan and let it run through the process, and it'll make the same suggestion assuming the data behind it doesn't change. So deleting the planning worksheet doesn't hurt your system in any way. It just means you have to calculate your process again if you want it to repopulate with suggestions. Okay, so like I said, it created a purchase order. It's the last one in my list is the one that I expect it to be. Okay, so there's our item for the MRP. We'll go ahead and put in a fun purchase invoice, do our work date and post this. And I have my scanners, so we'll go ahead and enter it as if I had scanned it, and we'll go ahead and do receive an invoice. Okay, so I've increased my quantity on hand of that item. So now I have 50 units of that item in my inventory. Okay, so if we go back, take a look at our MRP item, we can see quantity on hand is now 50. If I come in and go down and look at my planning parameters, nothing changes here. This is all static information. But because I'm now above my reorder point, it is not going to suggest for me to buy this item again until we fall below 5. Okay, so if I consume some, if I sell some, as soon as I get 2 or below the reorder point, it will suggest I buy more. All right, so that's a look at the fixed reorder quantity. Next is the maximum quantity. This again is variable. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put in here 55. And so at 50 on hand, I'm below my reorder point. Okay, whenever we get to 55, we order up to 75. Okay, and I have on here an order multiple, so in orders of 5. Now, if I make this 10, then what the system's going to do is say, well, you're at 50, you're trying to get to 75, so you're down 25, but we have to order in multiples of 10. So how many times does 10 go into 25? Twice. So it's going to be 20 units that it would suggest. Okay, so I'll go and run this. And what I'm expecting to see happen is that it orders 20 units. Okay, so it's not going to be all the way up to my maximum, but it's also not going to be over my maximum, which is what maximum inventory is all about, is that I do not want to exceed my maximum inventory of 75. So because I'm ordering in multiples of 10, I can only order 20. If I ordered 30, then I'd be at 80, I'd be above the limit, wouldn't work. Okay, so assuming that this is correct, we'll go and run it, and we'll expect to see that the system suggests I buy 20 units. So I'll come in, calculate my regenerative plan. Again, not changing anything. It kept all my previous filters, so I don't have to do anything here. We'll just run it. Oh, and it calculated 30. So I've got something wrong. Maybe I have a, we'll take a quick look at it. 25 order multiple. Oh, it hasn't updated my order multiple, it looks like. So it should have respected that. So we'll, again, we're able to delete and go back. So we'll go and take a look at that item again and see if we can't update something that gets us closer to that 20 mark. Okay. So I come back in and we'll come down here. There's an additional field called the overflow limit. I don't think that's what's controlling it. We're at 50. That's not the quantity on hand. I just happen to know that it's 50. 50 trying to get to 75, order multiple of 10. That's interesting. I would expect at this point that it would order my 20. So I'm not 100% what I'm missing. That's pretty bad on my part, but I hadn't tested that specific scenario. Before this was 5, I'm kind of wondering if I didn't give the system enough time to update on it and know that it's 10 at this point. But we're gonna move on from that one. We'll have to circle back and find out what I made the mistake on later. Okay, but that's something that can happen, right? As you run into it and you find that you're not getting the result you want, talk to us. We're going to look at it. We're going to go through certain troubleshooting steps that I don't really want to go through all of today. But there's a process, and you just kind of check things off the list to work through it and find out what it was. It's 95% data issues. The other part is sometimes human error, where I run it with a bad date or I run it with a bad location. Still considered data, but that's more of a user error than it is data error. So I'm sure there's something here that is causing my issue. All right, so let's change it up and let's go to the order policy. Now, something that's really important on this reordering policy is that you'll notice it grays out certain boxes. Okay, so just because there's data in those fields does not mean it's using them. Hopefully that's showing up on everyone's screen okay. Like if I go to fixed reorder, these boxes are available. If I go to lot for lot, some of them are available, so the modifiers are available, but these are not, okay? So depending on the field you're on or the selection you make, certain fields gray out, and I cannot make changes to those. Okay, that means it's not part of the equation. So it is not looking at an accumulation period. It is not looking at a reorder point. In fact, this include inventory is unchecked, meaning it doesn't even look at the 50 I have on hand. Okay, and I can actually show that to you because what I'll do is I'll go to, we have quantity on hand of 50. There's ways to associate those 50 to orders if I have them. But if I go to we'll just create a new one. We'll create a new sales order to customer 20,000 for our item 5,000. And we'll order 5 of them. Okay, we have 50 on hand, right? So I shouldn't order 5 more. Well, in an order policy, it's going to order 5 more. So it does not include inventory in the calculation for an order policy. So when I run this, I'm expecting to get a quantity of 5. And a lot of people, that may blow their mind and be like, why would it do that? Well, the order policy is a one-for-one relationship, and you don't want to turn it on to items that have existing inventory unless you have a plan to reduce that inventory, okay? And I can, so I can go and set a reservation on that item ledger, and I can say, of the 50, I want to reserve 5 for this sales order, and then it'll ship out of that inventory, and it won't give me this suggestion, okay? So there are ways to allocate or reserve the on-hand inventory in an order policy so that I can consume that first without getting these suggestions. But you do need to understand, if you do not set that reservation, the system ignores that inventory altogether and it tells you to buy more, okay? So that is where that kind of suggestion comes into play. All right, now we're going to do one other thing here. We're going to go back to our item and we're going to look at lot for lot. The order policy and the lot for lot policy are very similar. Okay, so the lot for lot policy is still an order or demand based policy where it groups certain amounts of demand within what's called an accumulation period. So in my case, it's 2 weeks. So any sales orders that have demand within a 2-week period, it's going to group that together and it's going to suggest for me enough supply to cover it. Okay, now you'll notice the include inventory is checked. I don't know why someone would actually turn this off in the lot policy, so I'm going to suggest you always leave this on, okay? And the simple reason for that, and why I like it better than the order policy, is because when I go to the planning worksheet and I come and prepare the plan, now I don't get the suggestion, okay? Before I got a suggestion for a quantity of 5. Well, the system knows that I have 50 on hand. I had a sales order for 5, I'm still going to have 45 on hand. There's no reason to buy more at this time. And so that's why I'm a big fan of the lot for lot policy, is because of that ability to include inventory and still have a demand-based requisition process. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and create another sales order. I want to show you one other aspect of the order policy, because we mentioned that it groups demand, right? So I don't need to fill in, I'm not posting it. So we have this new order in the system for 8. Okay, and we'll go and take a look at that item one more time, and we'll flip it back to the order policy. Again, 1-to-1, not grouping demand. So again, it's going to ignore my inventory, but I want you to see what happens when I have 2 sales orders in the same time period. I didn't change any of the dates, and I run my planning worksheet. Okay, again, you should always know what you're expecting before you run it. So what I am expecting when I run this is a suggestion for 5 and a suggestion for 8. 2 separate lines, even though they're going to be from the same vendor for the same date. I'm not drop shipping it to the customer or anything like that. It's just the specific policy I'm in is a 1-to-1, so it does not group the demand. So even though I'm buying it from the same vendor, they have the same due date, same order date, everything is the same other than the quantity, the system is going to treat it as 2 separate lines. When it creates the purchase order, it'll be a line for 5 and a line for 8. Okay, now that works out well if it's demand for a production order, because as it comes in, I'll be able to say I need to allocate 5 for this production order, or I need to allocate these 8 for this job or this assembly order, and it works great for that. But you have to take into account that I have 50 sitting on my shelf and it still told me to go and buy more. Okay, so know what you're getting into, know what the plans do, and work with it and try to understand that particular policy within the item. Okay, but again, you can change these, set them for whatever you want to try to simulate. And again, don't make it unrealistic. Okay, you want to try to create a blank item, put it at all zeros, and control the situation so that you know when I run this lot for lot policy that it's going to group my demand, and then it's going to give me certain suggestions. Now I'm going to do one more thing here. We'll just go ahead and consume those 20. So we'll just use a job journal to get it out of the system. So we'll come in, work date, random. So what I'm going to do right now is simply take the material off of my shelf, because we have 50 on hand and we don't want them, right? So we're going to go to our main location. We'll consume all of them, and we'll go ahead and deplete that inventory. Okay. So all I'm doing right there is simply zeroing out my inventory back to 0. And again, the lot for lot policy has been selected. So now you get to see what that policy looks like. So the 2 sales orders I have, they're within the same time period for this item that's in a lot for lot accumulation period. So what I'm expecting to see the outcome of, 5 plus 8, 13. So I expect to see a supply order. I have a multiple on there, so if I had it left at 10, I would expect to see an order for 20. I had forgotten about my modifier. I hope I left it on at 10, but we'll find out. And so I'm expecting 13. We'll go and take a look at the item. I may have removed it. If I didn't, then I'm going to have to find out why it's not looking. Yeah, so order multiple is not being taken into account right now. So I'll have to look at that. That's new. So maybe that's a BC17 issue that I'll have to address, but I was expecting, because I have 13 and a multiple of 10, that I should get an order for 20. So I'm not 100% sure why it didn't take that into account. I will point out one thing. So before I was clicking on this warning to see the, oh, maybe it's because it's, I bet that's it. So solve my own issue. Has to be realistic dates. So both of my sales orders, I believe, are in the past. So let's see if we can't fix this one first, and then I'll show you why it mattered. All right, so we'll go and take a look real quick because I think this is a quick thing to address. Both of these have a date of 4/6. Is when my client is ordering it, and that doesn't work for me because the horizon date I'm using is 4/7, so I'm using 1 day after. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to update something called the requested delivery date, and we're going to say that they don't want it until August 12th. Okay, and we'll use something similar for both of them. Oops, 8/12/20. And I'll have that update my line. We'll go to the next sales order, and we'll update this one, make it 8/15/20. So they're still within that 2-week time period, but that should fix my issue. What it was really doing is just getting me back up to a 0, because I was ordering in the past not realistic. So as long as I'm using a realistic forward date, it can plan it properly. So now I should get 20, perfect. So at least I demonstrate I know a little bit about this stuff. And my warning went away. So the whole reason it was ordering 13 and not 20, it was still enough to get me to my, my stock level, or at least fulfill the demand that I had, but it was in a past date. Okay, and when I'm trying to run the MRP for dates that are in the past, that doesn't work. It's not realistic. This is a forward-looking planning worksheet. It still met all of the need, right? So it still ordered the 13, but it didn't respect the planning parameters. And that was because it's in the past and it's not feasible, okay? So the system says, let's get it back up to 0 so that we can start this planning on the right foot. And so that's why it ordered the 13 and not the 20. But now that my dates are realistic, they're in the future, the system says, okay, within a certain time period, you have 13 units of demand. You have a multiplier on there of 10. The next closest above 13 with using that multiplier is 20. And so that's why I'm getting an order of 20. Now, will that fix my max inventory? No. I'm going to have to go and look at that one differently and find out what I have set wrong on that one. It's got to be data related. Could easily be user related too, but that's a different discussion. But the fun part about this is you can work with it, and most of the time you can correct it fairly quickly. If you just play with the data and try to realize what was the expected outcome, what was I trying to get to, and did I hit the mark? And if I didn't, what could be those sources of issue? So in this case, hitting that little window here let me know that I was in the past. And as soon as I read that it was -13, I knew exactly what the issue was. Okay, so those are things that you learn as you start using it and seeing what the system does. I can see the order multiple here. What you don't see is the demand for this. So again, we're in a lot for lot policy, demand driven policy. Okay, so there is a option for that called order tracking. So we are ordering 20, and we're ordering 20 because of 2 sales orders in our system with a quantity of 5 and a quantity of 8. Okay, so the system will show you those specific orders, and it will show you the entire hierarchy if there's more. So remember, we talked at the very beginning about a sales order creating demand for a finished good. So that creates a production order. That production order creates demand for a subassembly. That subassembly creates order for a component. Okay, so as it goes through that chain, you would see each of those listed here when you go to the component. So at the very lower level, I get to see all of the upper levels that it is related to, all the way back to the primary source of demand. So in this case, it's a sales order. This could be a production order. So if I'm building to stock that finished good, I may have subassemblies that are make to order. I may have components that are lot for lot or order policy. I will see that chain of demand listed here for each of those items in that kind of hierarchy. Okay, you don't see this with a fixed reorder or a max quantity because they're stock policies. It's not based on demand, it's because your inventory is low. So as soon as your inventory hits below a level, it's not because demand caused it to do that, it's just where it is at that time period. And so because of that, then it tells you to order more. Okay. Now, last thing I'll talk about as we're coming up on the end of the hour here is people will always ask us, what is our suggestion on, depending on the policy, for these parameters? Like, what should my reorder point be? What should my reorder quantity be? We cannot answer those questions for you. Okay, while I wish I had a magic 8-ball that would just tell me the answers to those, it's based on your numbers. Okay, this is a living, breathing thing. When I'm using fixed reorder policy, the reorder point may change. So if I have a reorder policy that says when you're at or below 15, order 50, and we stock out every single week. Okay, maybe changing the reorder point to 20 will do it, and then we don't stock out. Right now, I may have a huge month where we have a salesperson who just knocks it out of the park and they sell a bunch. Well, that's an anomaly, right? And so do we come and adjust that for this? Is that salesperson going to be doing that same thing every month from this point on? If so, great. Let's go and adjust our numbers to make sure we can meet that demand. But if that was just a crazy good season, then I don't necessarily want to adjust this. But you can, okay? So I can adjust this for what's going on in my business during that season. We just went through an unprecedented pandemic. So what happened last year doesn't necessarily dictate what's going to happen this year, and what happens this year doesn't necessarily dictate what's going to happen next year. Okay, so things change. We have to be watching this, be aware of it. If we're running into stockout issues or we're carrying way too much inventory, we adjust our numbers and we run inventory turn reports, and we run reports that are going to tell us, should I be adjusting these numbers? Okay. Microsoft is introducing artificial intelligence in their Cortana planning engine to help run some of those numbers for you. You do have to build up at least 6 months worth of data to make that, to give any kind of reasonable expectation that that's going to improve your results. But those are things that the software is doing to help make this a more computer-driven, machine learning type of experience, so that it's not just on a person to constantly be checking those turn reports, but to have a machine learning environment that can help with that. Now, again, that's future planning, right? Getting started with MRP is running some tests, picking some items, and turning it on and letting it make some suggestions to you. The biggest takeaway from this, they're just suggestions, okay? When I run the planning worksheet, I still have control. Whatever it tells me to do here, I still am the one that clicks the button to carry it out, okay? It's not automated to do the purchasing for me. to do any of the receiving, the invoicing, all of that is separate, okay? MRP is what is the system going to suggest I buy at this moment in time? And it's all based on our data. Data, bad results. So you do want to make sure your inventory counts are good. You have your location set. If you're using bins, make sure you're managing that. Make sure your numbers and your data are good so that as you start to work with this, it's giving you the suggestions that make sense for actual numbers. Okay. So I think I'll stop there. There's more I can talk about. There's more advanced strategies to this. If I am getting a planning worksheet that has 300 lines in it every single morning, and I'm running it and I'm carrying things out, then you're probably getting some clutter in there that you don't need. All right, and there's ways to quiet that down, especially if I'm in an environment where the requested date from my customer changes. So they place an order with us, and then 2 days later they send us an update to that order to say, I don't need that for another week. Okay, those are things that the MRP needs to know about. That demand has shifted a week in the future. What do you want the system to do with it? It can ignore it, or it can suggest to cancel and create a new order. It can do a lot of things. So you need to be able to manage those, and there's advanced strategies that we can help with. So getting started, take a sample item in a test environment and just zero everything out and try to make a realistic order and a realistic buy decision. Okay, see if you can make the system make the suggestion that you would manually, and then apply it to 2 items and then 5 items. And then as you're starting to get more and more comfort level with it, then try some different things. Add a purchase order that's already in the system, but we get a spike in demand. What happens then? Because remember, the purchase order is a supply. It's not on our shelf yet, but it's a date that we expect to receive that material in. Where does that come into play with what suggestions the system makes for me? Okay, so there's complex things you can run with this, and you want to test it all thoroughly. Once you've tested your information, then we move it to a live environment, but we have to do our testing first. Okay, that's the most important piece of information I can give you. Go into a test environment and test the process thoroughly. Make sure you're comfortable with it. You don't want to turn it on and then just say, well, what is that? I don't know why it did that for me. You want to be able to troubleshoot it and find out. Okay, so work through it. Ask us questions, reach out to us. You can hit us at support@accenterp.com. You can always call us by phone, but we want to help you with this. We want to make the MRP experience good for your business, and we want to see everybody using this. It's a really, really powerful tool within the software, and you want to make use of it. We talk about utilization of software all the time. This is one of the